time on this very hot, humid, sticky Washington day to join. We have John Westover, who was a POSCO Fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu, our main home office, and he was there for a couple months in 2016, 2017, and then came to us here where he was previously a visiting fellow at the Wilson Center, and delighted to have him. And, of course, Kimberly and Elliott from the Center for Global Development. We're delighted. Thank you so much for taking the time to be a discussant today. And as I said to them, I don't know much about this topic at all, but what intrigued me about it is so much discussion these days about the future of labor, impact on manufacturing sector, implications of automation, et cetera, that it's just a grand opportunity to hear from people who are working on cross-national data sets, who've really gotten into the topic and learned some of the findings about workplace conditions and future implications, because it comes up all the time, the future of labor. And so this is a really wonderful opportunity. John has said that he has a PowerPoint, and he's going to take approximately 40 or so minutes to run us through the PowerPoint and his findings, and then we'd invite Kim to take about 20 minutes to discuss, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. John, your show is yours.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy visits to Washington, D.C., and I appreciate you attending the talk today, and for Dr. Elliott joining us as well for the discussion. As you can see, it's kind of a lengthy title, but in a nutshell, what I hope to discuss with you today is just some of the workplace characteristics that have shifted over time throughout the Northeast Asian region, as well as in Russia and the Philippines, and look at some of the reasons why that might be the case, the global political, the geopolitical, the economic aspects of some of those changes. A lot of what often gets discussed in terms of cross-national differences in the experience of work happens within the realm of cross-cultural management and cultural differences across countries, which is certainly an important factor, but it's certainly not the only factor. And I would argue there's also many macro structural elements that strongly influence the conditions in the workplace, that influence workers' attitudes and their performance and those types of things. And so that's what I hope to explore with you today. I welcome any questions. Quite frankly, I'm happy to take questions throughout the presentation, but if we want to wait till the end, that's fine too. And I'll do my best to respond to your questions. Hopefully, I can couch it within those questions within the data that I've been examining and provide some satisfactory answers. The data that I'll largely be utilizing and presenting to you today come from two cross-national attitudinal databases, the World Values Survey and the International Social Survey Program data sets. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, as well as just some economic data that comes from a variety of sources. I'm not going to read to you my lengthy abstract slide. You can see the details of kind of the overview of the presentation in the handout and the details for the program today. But I do want to briefly discuss the agenda for what I hope to cover. First, I thought it would be worthwhile to take a few minutes and talk about international political economy. I hope that I'm not speaking to you in a way that is unnecessary, but oftentimes this isn't everyone's field, and so I figured just taking a couple minutes and talking about that would be helpful. And then I wanted to take probably the first half of the presentation to really provide some context. I want to present some economic data that helps us see what's happening in these countries over time. Also a little bit of attitudinal data from the World Values Survey. And following that, I'll get into my analysis using the International Social Survey Program. I'll run through the theoretical model, the hypotheses, describe the data, walk you through some of the findings and results, and then we'll have discussion about implications. Before I jump into international political economy, I thought I would just set the groundwork a little bit first. And what we're examining here are changes in the workplace over an extended period of time, and we could choose any points in time to examine that. I'm looking for really from the early 80s primarily, though some of the economic data that I'll show you comes a little bit later or a little bit earlier to that time frame. But overall, we're looking at changes in structure of the economy, reconfiguration of the employment by sector, provisions of social benefits, and the nature of labor markets and how those have shifted over time as these global structural factors that influence shifts in impacts shifts on workers, labor organizations, and the politics of production. Of course, this is influenced by a variety of economic factors, geopolitical factors, but there's also human interest considerations that are very important that we should always consider as we're talking about real people in real organizations experiencing work as a major part of their daily lives. Other considerations that I think are worth thinking about in relation to this data and some of the discussion that we might have here today is just over the last 30, 40, 50 years, the shifting rule of law across nations, particularly in this region that we're going to be examining, the rise of nationalism and populism, particularly recently, regulatory standards and how those have shifted over time, the evolving civil society that we've seen across the globe, corporate social responsibility, and the list could go on. There's lots of very practical elements that we can and probably should be considering as we think about some of the data that I'm going to present to you. Also, before I move into the agenda and some of the data, I thought I would just briefly provide an overview of some of the current, some examples of some of the current conditions in these countries that we're going to be examining today, primarily China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and the Philippines. So first, a quick example in China. You all may already be very familiar with the Foxconn factory issues and iPhone production and some of the atrocities that have been well documented in those factories. It's just a great example of global pressures and global markets impacting labor force within the Chinese context and having a very real impact on the lives of those workers. Similarly, we often hear about supply chain channels for various multinational organizations. And one example in Taiwan would be Patagonia. They've had a series of issues with some of their suppliers and factories, the second-tier mills that help produce some of their products. And within the Taiwanese context, there's a lot of issues with exploited labor and trafficking and labor brokers and some of these types of issues that I think are particularly relevant. Within Russia, of course, there's a regular and consistent discussion about corruption, both within the government but also within industry. And Russia, I'll show you this in a little bit, but historically, I say historically over the last several decades, particularly the last couple decades, relatively low unemployment rates, particularly given financial crises and economic downturns. They've consistently kept their unemployment rate fairly low, but along with that, there's the hidden unemployment that doesn't necessarily show up in their official rates, reduced pay, shortened work weeks. Those types of issues are very relevant in Russia right now. Within the Philippines, we have issues of child labor, low wages and cost of living, living wage issues, in part based on U.S. tariff policies, but other issues as well. There's rights at work issues, worker protection issues, social dialogue issues within the workplace in the Philippines. In Japan, we have declining job security and wages in a country that's had a very robust economy for a very long time, but has started to see some decline in those areas. And so then the question becomes, well, why? What is really influencing that? In South Korea, actually South Korea and China rank among the world's worst for workers by multiple organizations. And so what are those conditions in South Korea, in China, that contribute to a worst for workers rating, which is not a particularly illustrious rating that you would want. So these are some of the types of things that we're going to talk about, and I think how the data connects to real-life issues within each of these countries. All right, first, international political economy. This is a very interdisciplinary field, and as a backdrop, my personal connection and experience with international political economy comes from the sociological realm. My PhD is in sociology, comparative international studies. But it brings together a lot of different academic schools, most notably political economy, political science, economics, sociology, history, cultural studies, all of which have different ways of framing the discussion around IPE issues. So I'm coming mostly from a sociological perspective. International political economy is ultimately concerned with the ways in which political forces, states, institutions, individuals, actors shape the systems through which economic interactions are expressed and impact economic interactions, including the power of collective markets and individuals acting both within and outside of them, and what these have upon political structures. So that's, again, just a really quick and dirty definition of why we're discussing all of this, how it all fits together. This next slide, you can see this is a little bit of a clumsy diagram, but it's my best initial effort at just trying to pull together and combine various sociological theories of comparative international sociological theories and how they connect with international political economy. And really, I think it would be better to have this kind of a diagram more in a 3D kind of a mode rather than flat 2D, but it is what it is. But it helps us at least provide some general rough placement of various countries along a spectrum of sorts so that we can have a general idea of how they kind of relate to each other. So that's the main point of this diagram, not to be prescriptive or anything like that specifically. So you can see along the right-hand axis, the role of the state. This is based on Coley's statist typology that he put forward, where we have fragmented multi-class states, cohesive capitalist states, and neo-patrimonial states. And I don't want to bore you with all the details of this theory and the ins and outs of all those different classifications, but generally speaking, it has to do with the role of the development of democratization, the role of civil society within these countries, and some of those sorts of things. And so if you just place these countries along those three items, you can kind of see roughly how I would say they sort of lay out. Along the bottom, you have the level of industrialization, Wallerstein's typology of the world system, where we have the periphery, the semi-periphery, and the core. Again, if you kind of map them out across those three areas, you can kind of see how they lay out. Along the left-hand side, we have level of economic development, GDP. You can see roughly where countries might lay out across those. And then along the top, you see a post-Neo-Fordist kind of perspective looking at sectoral composition across agricultural, industrial, and service sector economies as the predominant sectors of their economies. And again, it becomes a little clumsy as you're trying to, on a flat 2D model, trying to place countries within that. So it's not perfect, but it does help us have at least a general sense of where countries stack up a little bit. Each of these theories directly relate back to, and we can tie them back to, conditions and potential conditions within the workplace. So a couple of my main questions really motivating and guiding this research. First, are there significant differences in the job quality characteristics and perceived experience of workers cross-nationally over time, particularly within this region? And I think I'll show you and demonstrate to you that, yes, there are very significant differences. I think that is no surprise. But then secondly, and probably more importantly, what are those country-level social, political, economic, and cultural contextual variables that are really driving these shifting cross-national differences of the experience within the workplace and the labor force?
Extraction is industrial?
What's that?
Extraction is part of the industrial sector?
Yes. Yes, sir. I could go into more detail about specific hypotheses that relate to each of these specific theories. I'm not going to take the time or bore you with that right now, though I'm certainly happy to explore that offline or have some more discussion about it later. So now let me just, I'm going to run through these fairly quickly, but I want to just provide some general context so we can see how these countries stack up with each other. So first, the first several graphs actually have to do with gross domestic product. The first one is just raw gross domestic product, 1960 to 2014. You can see China is in, I know this is a little bit small to read probably, but China's in purple, Japan's in red. We have South Korea in yellow, Russia in blue, and the Philippines in green. That gives you a general sense of how they stack up in comparison to one another. And I think of particular note, which is no surprise to any of us, I'm sure, is the nearly exponential rise of China's economy over the last decade and a half, 2 decades. We saw similar, very rapid growth in Japan a couple decades earlier, which has since kind of leveled out. And then you see Russia and Korea that have seen somewhat similar trajectories in terms of GDP growth, and the Philippines has just been very level, stagnant, slow growth, all of which or the Philippines, of course, which is way below the world kind of average. Here we can see GDP per capita based on purchase price parity from 1990 to 2015. So this slide and the next slide just give us a little bit more apples-to-apples comparison of GDP. And here we can see Japan and Korea at the top, Russia in the middle. You can see the world GDP, PPP right there in blue. And then you have China and then the Philippines on the bottom. So despite this huge exponential growth of China, of course, in the recent decades, when we look at it based on purchasing price parity, it's still far lower than we see in Japan, Korea, Russia. Oh, I also wanted to mention, I had mentioned that we're going to talk about Taiwan, and particularly when we get into more attitudinal data later, there will be more about Taiwan. For running some of these numbers, though, it's not always separated out specifically from China to Taiwan. And then another interesting way of looking at GDP is GDP per person employed. So this graph shows you that breakdown. Again, it's similar to what we see in the purchasing price parity slide in terms of kind of how they stack up and relate to one another, with Japan and Korea being at the top, Russia in the middle, China and the Philippines at the bottom. Another really important element, particularly when we're looking at strength of overall economic development, is the level of foreign direct investment within a nation state, as well as the level of gross savings as a percentage of overall GDP. So this slide and the next slide look at those two elements. And here you can see over time the levels of foreign direct investment net inflows from 76 to 2014. You can again see a huge spike in Chinese foreign direct investment in the early 90s. Since then, it's kind of come down a little bit. Another big spike around 2005, 2006, as well as a rather large spike in around 2006, 2007 in Russia. That's of interest because, it's a big academic debate in terms of the role of foreign direct investment in strengthening overall economic development. But often, what it comes down to is a country's overdependence on, hopefully that doesn't actually restart, a country's overdependence on foreign direct investment can actually reduce its long-term trajectory. It can actually cause stagnation and actual decline potentially. And so when we see this huge spike, for example, in China, if that hadn't have come back down and leveled off a little bit, that could have actually had some very negative long-term implications for China. Here we see gross savings as a percentage of GDP from 76 to 2014. And again, this just overall gives us a good glimpse of how the different countries kind of compare to one another. Gross savings in China and the Philippines is near 50%. In South Korea, it's kind of in the mid-30s. In Japan and Russia, it's roughly in the mid-20s. Now getting into some more labor-specific elements. Here we see labor participation rate 1990 to 2014. And, I mean, you almost never see a graph where everything is so level, right? But here we can see Russia's labor force participation rate has been just incredibly stable and steady over time, just a little under 50%. China's has declined slightly, about a 3% decline over the last decade or so, but still a pretty stable number. Below that, we have Japan, just a little bit over 40%, South Korea a little bit under 40%, and the Philippines that hovers right around that 36 to 37% mark in terms of labor participation rate. We can talk.
Do you know if there's a policy change in the Philippines? No.
Oh, sorry.
There's kind of a jump.
There's a little blip.
And I wonder if that was like the nursing or
Yeah.
Overseas foreign worker.
Yeah. I don't know if they would be included in this, or it's just interesting that it seems like a.
Yeah, and I don't know specifically. That's a really good question. But you raised a couple important points already. About overseas workers, as well as kind of the second tier employment market within the Philippines, which has implications for their overall rate and what it's being reported at versus what it's probably underreported and what the actual reporting rate might be. Here we see unemployment rate from 91 to 2014. Again, volatility over time for various countries, particularly in Russia and the Philippines. A rather steep decline or steep incline in unemployment rate in the Philippines from the late 90s to the early 2000s, but then a sharp drop, as well as a steep increase in the mid to late 90s in Russia, and then a pretty steady drop. And then China, Japan, and Korea have been fairly similar and stable over the last at least the last decade and a half, 2 decades.
Do you do the participation rates and unemployment rates also by population growth? I was thinking in Japan, declining population and declining unemployment. You'd expect more unemployment, but if there's declining population, maybe it's offset by the fact that there's. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have anything specifically laid off based on that. But you're absolutely right that one of the serious issues that Japan is facing right now is their aging population. It's part of the reason why they're experiencing labor shortages, actually. It's an interesting paradox because in Japan, while they have this aging population, they're experiencing labor shortages, but they also see a decline in job security and a decline in wages all at the same time. And typically, when we see labor shortage, you're not going to see decline in job security and a decline in wages at the same time.
But is the decline in wages deflationary pressure or actual decline?
Actual decline.
Huh? Because
Inflation should increase wages. Real wages.
Yeah.
Because it's offset, but Japanese friend, when I go to Japan, it's always offset also by the cost of things has decreased too because of deflation.
Sure.
So that actual purchasing power in some cases has risen despite the.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another interesting aspect with the wage issue in Japan is when we say job security and wage levels are declining in Japan, this is true, but it's also important to consider what we're comparing that to, right? Historically, they've had incredibly high levels of job security, more so than most places, right? And so, in part, they're seeing decline because they're feeling global pressures to kind of change management practices, get rid of, lifetime employment, those types of things. I mean, anything less than lifetime employment is going to be a reduction in job security, right?
Right.
Yeah, so all important points. Here we see the age dependency ratio across countries, 1960 to 2015.
What's that a ratio of what to what?
Age dependency ratio is the ratio of dependents, so people younger than 15 or older than 64 generally, for the retirement age, to the working population, so those within the 15 to 64 range. So you can see in Japan the increasing, this relates back to what we were just saying, but the increasing dependency ratio in Japan, where there's been mostly a decline in dependency ratio across other countries with a little uptick in Russia and China recently, just in the last few years. Here we see self-employed workers, 1980 to 2012. Again, it just gives us a general sense, and you note that a couple countries aren't included in this graph because data wasn't available, but we can see a much higher level of self-employed workers in the Philippines compared to everyone else, a little bit lower in Korea and then much lower in Japan and Russia.
This is self-employed is the same as formerly employed, not employed. You're self-employed don't include the informal sector.
No, it does not. Yeah, it's formally employed self-employed. Yeah. Good.
Formally,
Good point.
yeah, that's a good distinction.
Yeah.
Say street vendors and all that don't count.
Yeah. So anyone who is not officially counted because it's under the table, yeah, not concluded here. Absolutely. Okay. So now that's some aggregated, economic labor data. I probably should move a little bit faster, but just a few. I'll throw out a handful of worker attitudes that have also shifted over this period of time. This is just all descriptive data from the World Values Survey. So the first we can see here, and then here we see Taiwan entering the picture because we have data for Taiwan specifically broken out from China. We see the importance of work and life as an attitude. And we can see overall a decline in the importance of work and life among Russians, and a rather steep decline in the Philippines, but pretty stable in Japan, pretty stable in Taiwan, at least over the last couple waves of the data collection that we have. So I think that's interesting to see just the importance that people put on work within their daily life. Also the attitude that hard work brings success. This is often kind of stereotypically seen as an attribute of many Asian countries, that they have this work ethic and this idea that hard work will bring success in their lives. You can see a steep decline in Russia from 2005 to the most recent wave of the data. You can see an increase in South Korea and a decline in Japan. So I think that's interesting.
For all of these countries, sorry.
Yeah.
Because I think the world surveys you said in there are each 5 years, so you have a range there, but is it actually the first year of that range is when the survey?
It depends on the country.
Depends on the country.
Yep. Yeah. So that's a good question. The reason I put a range for each wave is because sometime during that range of years, within that wave of data collection, those countries all had their data collected. Yeah. So that is important to know because it is, we're trying to do some apples to apples comparisons, but it's a little apples to something slightly different than apples. Probably not apples to oranges, but a little bit different
Pears?
than apples to pears. Yeah. Here we see life satisfaction. I put this one in here specifically because life satisfaction has so many connections to the workplace and the experience of workers, and because people spend so much of their lives working, their experience within the workplace has a huge impact on life satisfaction as well. So here we see life satisfaction over time across waves. You can see there's data missing across multiple waves in various countries, but at least this gives us a general sense of how they compare and stack up, with Russia having the lower life satisfaction of these countries, the Philippines having the highest, and the others kind of falling in there.
Sorry, just
Yeah.
is there an urban bias on these world value surveys?
Say again?
Is there an urban bias on the world value surveys?
Yeah, interesting question.
That's interesting.
Simply because, yes, when you're dealing with big countries like China, what does it mean?
Sure. Yeah, there's definitely that bias. There's several biases that happen. Ultimately, how do we make sense of a subjective indicator like someone saying it's all self-report, right? So I'm taking a survey and I'm saying how satisfied am I with my life on 1 out of 10, right? And how
Depends on the day you're asked.
Well, it depends on the day you're asked. It depends on, in the Philippines, it depends on expectation, right? So what's my expectation for life versus the reality that I experience in the Philippines, Korea, Japan, China, or whatever. And so what this shows us is this isn't like actual quality of life. This is just how their expectations meet with their experience, right? And so that's important. But what's interesting about life satisfaction as an indicator and a variable in various analyses is that regardless of those biases and regardless of the various reasons why people will rate themselves higher or lower, we see very clear connection between someone's perceived life satisfaction and a whole variety of other outcomes. So even if the life of someone in the Philippines is actually worse than the life of someone in Japan, but they just rate themselves higher, the fact that they think their life is really good actually really matters, if that makes sense.
But there are situations where you can have improvement conditions, but because they're associated with displacement, you can be less satisfied.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. And there's a whole slew of reasons why those types of changes could actually negatively impact someone's stated life satisfaction, which could have long-term positive implications for them. Absolutely. And really the same caveats that we were just expressing with life satisfaction could be said for a lot of these indicators. These are all self-reported, subjective indicators, right? So here we have 4 factors that respondents in each of these countries said are most important in their job across 2 waves of the survey. I'm going to say remind me later.
Yeah, let's do that.
So I think it's particularly interesting that we see a safe job with no risk. That's the red up here. That's the biggest, the most frequently stated important factor in all of these, across all these countries, across the 2 waves of the data. But we do see a good amount of variation across the statement about income being really important, as well as doing an important work, and then working with people you really like. This is particularly interesting to me because you can see in South Korea, in every other country, it's fairly similar in terms of like the role of relationships in the workplace. In South Korea, not so much. They don't seem to really put that big of an emphasis on those relationships. A couple attitudes here. Work should always come first, and the weight that they place on work versus leisure across countries gives you a general sense of how they stack up in terms of work as a primary component of their life. I need to move on. Following instructions at work, future changes. I'm just going to kind of skip that, but basically this follows what we would often think of in terms of kind of cultural stereotypes in terms of following instructions at work. I'm going to skip this one, and then this will be my last one on these attitudes, and we'll move into the rest of it. So confidence in labor unions, confidence in major companies, and confidence in the government from mid-'90s to 2014. I think this one is particularly important because it has a lot. It starts to give us some insight about how these major institutions within within someone's life impacts it can have connections and impact many other areas of their lives. So you can see a rather in the top graph, you can see a rather continuous decline in South Korea in terms of the confidence in labor unions, which is not surprising if you're up on the news with unions in South Korea. So a steady decline. Also in Russia, a steady decline over the last couple decades in terms of confidence in labor unions. Confidence in major companies. In Russia, down here, you can see a major decline, but also a very positive rebound and increase in confidence in major companies. Pretty strong increase in South Korea, pretty stable in Japan, pretty strong increase in Taiwan and in the Philippines. And then finally, the confidence in government over here on the side. You can see across most countries, there's been decline in the confidence in government.
But Korea on companies, that's really, I mean, obviously the date precedes the recent scandals and chaebols and, relationship. It would be a very dramatic. Yeah, but there were earlier scandals too. I mean, this isn't the first time there's been a chaebol scandal. Right.
Yeah, the IMF is absolutely. Yeah, IMF is. Yeah, absolutely. I lived in South Korea over a number of years in the late 90s and then again in the early 2000s, and that was definitely a very salient issue in everyone's life was the IMF crisis. Absolutely. All right, I'm just taking too much time. So let me really quickly run you through the theoretical model for the further analysis, and I'll try to get through this really fast. So there's been lots of studies for many, many years looking at job satisfaction and looking at it across intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors in the workplace, and you can see how those lay out. And traditionally, we've had individual control variables. We've also had the cultural characteristics that have also often been controlled when doing cross-national research. What hasn't really happened much is looking at these country-contextual variables. And so that's something that I wanted to throw into the mix because, I think that culture is really important, but it's only one element in creating this context. I don't know if you can see this quote below the chair down here, but the main idea is meaning is derived from context. Observations are embedded and must be understood within a context. And so that context does not just include cross-cultural context. It includes the social systems and structures, the economic issues, all these sorts of things that relate then to intrinsic factors, extrinsic factors that will influence job satisfaction. Why does job satisfaction matter? Studies for decades have shown repeatedly that it has a positive relationship with life satisfaction, with job performance, with worker motivation, job involvement, organizational citizenship behaviors, organizational commitment, and worker health. It has a negative relationship with employee tardiness. So if you're more satisfied, you're going to have lower levels of tardiness, absenteeism, withdrawal cognitions, and stress. So these are all great things for workers, but it also is important for organizations because particularly when we're talking, some of this is like warm, fuzzy stuff, right? Like, does an organization really care if someone feels good about themselves and their life as long as they show up and do the job and do it well? Maybe not. But job satisfaction really relates to tardiness, absenteeism, stress, turnover. These are all areas that, regardless of the warm fuzzies, really impact firms where it counts. And so this is something that companies really need to pay close attention to. So in the data that I'm about to show you, it comes from the International Social Survey Program. I'm specifically today just going to show you data from the 2005 wave. They just released, just a couple weeks ago, the 2015 wave of data. I'm super excited to look at that and see what has changed over the last decade. But that's not going to be part of what I show you today. Multi-stage stratified probability sampling, a look at all workers within these countries, in some cases conducted via interviews, some cases questionnaires, and then there's the other data that I'm going to show you comes from a variety of sources: CIA, World Factbook, OECD, World Bank, UN, human development data, etc. We've already talked about one of the major limitations in dealing with attitudinal data is that these are subjective indicators. And in the case of the data that I'm going to show you, these are single item indicators. These aren't scales. And that's very typical in international surveys because you're trying to cover a lot in an international survey, and so you're not going to ask 30 questions with scales when you could ask 10 questions or 5 questions to get at the same basic idea. One of the countries that I've shown you in these other graphs that's not included in this data is China. And so I'm going to show you data for Taiwan, but not for China. So that's unfortunate. And there's other countries that would be really great to be able to include. Overall, there's 32 countries included in the 2005 wave. So these are the questions, the single item variables that go along with each of these main characteristics that we're looking at. So job satisfaction, how satisfied are you in your job? The various intrinsic characteristics and the extrinsic characteristics that are important. I don't think I need to read through all those, but you can kind of look through those quickly. And then we get to two big tables, and this will get me about close to finishing. This is really small, and I imagine it's really hard to see and read. So let me just kind of walk you through what we see here. I've kind of broken this down into various elements and categories. So in the top section, we have population, GDP, GDP per capita, government revenues, government expenditures, government revenues as a percentage of GDP, public debt as a percentage of GDP, and government expenditures as a percentage of GDP. And we can look at comparisons across countries. And what's probably not surprising, again, remember China's not included here, but what's probably not surprising is that we see Japan really kind of being the top dog in terms of these various broad level economic indicators. And then the next section looks at sectoral composition across these countries. And this is really important, particularly when we're looking at neo-post-Fordist theories and how that might impact conditions in the workplace. You can see again that in Japan, 74% service sector versus 25% industrial and just 1% agricultural. In South Korea, they still have a dominant service sector economy, but the strongest industrial sector of all the remaining countries. 67% service sector in Taiwan, 61% in Russia, 53% in the Philippines. And you'll note the Philippines is the only one of these 5 countries that has a sizable agricultural sector. Female labor force participation rate across these countries, 58% in Japan, 52.5% in South Korea, 45% in Taiwan, 57% in Russia, and about 57% in the Philippines. Kind of moving down. We haven't talked yet about Gini coefficient, and then there's several other indexes that are interesting to break out the data by. So Human Development Index, union density, that's not an index, but union density is an important one. Rigidity of Employment Index, Democracy Index, Economic Freedom Index. These are all interesting just as we're trying to make sense of why we see differences across countries. And then these bottom ones are all cultural, cross-cultural variables and differences.
I were just saying that the female labor force participation rate is, to me, surprisingly, similar.
Yeah, it's fairly similar.
I wouldn't have expected that given the range of the economies and the context along your, the 4-quadrant chart. I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah. So an analysis that is too much to go into today, what we can do is we can actually create a hierarchical linear model to show how the different elements of the theoretical model that I showed you earlier impact. So holding all country characteristics constant, then measuring individual controls and individual responses to the main variables, and then how those influence job satisfaction. So that's ultimately what I did. What's also interesting is to run regressions based on different classifications of say, high or low economic freedom index or high or low rigidity of employment index. And you can do those across each country and see vastly, it's really interesting to start to see vastly different qualities emerge as being most significant in countries that have, for example, high or low human development index scores. So I'm not going to go into all of that today, though there's really tons of really interesting stuff to explore as we...
Economic freedom index,
What's that?
whose economic freedom index?
Good question. Let me...
Heritage or
Probably heritage.
heritage?
I think so.
Several different ones.
Right.
Although I think that's the one that's called economic freedom.
Yeah, it's heritage. Yeah. And with each of these indexes, there's pros and cons and biases and whatnot, but it's still interesting to try to look at how these compare up to each other.
Yeah, Russia's the outlier on the economic freedom index.
Yeah, yep, Russia has the lowest of those. Low means less free.
Which is free to choose what you do with your money. Is that what it means? In short?
So yes, economic freedom, the free trade. Yes, exactly.
International.
Free trade. The other one that's interesting is the rigidity of employment index. And that's based on policies and regulations within a given country related to the labor market and how easy it is for firms to hire, fire, start up.
Doing business indicators?
Yes, doing business indicators.
Wonder where France would fit on that.
France has, yes, France
Emphasis on-
France is very rigid. Yes. Okay, so this will be the last data that I show you, and then I'll give the floor over to my colleague. But here you can see the first of all, job satisfaction mean. So just the general overall mean score across countries. We can see how they compare one with another. So 5.4 out of 7 on a 7-point scale. In Japan, in terms of how satisfied they are, in South Korea it's 4.7, in Taiwan it's 5, Russia it's 5.2, Philippines it's 5.3, and for all 32 countries included in the data, it's 5.25. And then we start to look at, so this is just general overall regression results of these job characteristics and how it impacts job satisfaction. Okay, so we have management-employee relations, coworker relations, job autonomy, promotional opportunities, interesting work as intrinsic factors. We have job security, pay, workload, physical effort, danger as extrinsic factors. And then we have a whole slew of individual control variables that we look at. And then down here along the bottom, then we see the size of the sample in those countries for the year. And then we see the adjusted R-squared and the F value. So I think what's two things that are particularly worth noting here is one, the adjusted R-squared variation across these countries. Okay, so we see fairly similar predictability of the model across 4 of these 5 countries, all in the low to mid 30% range. So 30% of the variation in job satisfaction can be described by these variables in those countries. But then we look over at the Philippines and we see that this model does not fit. I mean, it still predicts about 20% of the variability in job satisfaction, but that's way lower than in all these other countries. And because I've worked with this data so much, I can tell you that what's interesting too is if we compare this region with, say, the EU or North America, we see that these adjusted R-squareds are way lower than we see in the EU or in North America. So Western industrialized countries, this model fits way better, like up in the 50 to 60% range. Okay, so that's interesting. That means that while of course all of these factors are important, and you can see which ones based on the little stars that shows a significance level in the table, you can see that there's some variation across countries in terms of which variables are actually significant in the model versus not. When we start to get into like the EU or North America, pretty much all of the variables are significant across each country. And so in Northeast Asia, Russia, the Philippines, they're just, they're not as worried about job autonomy, for example, that we're so concerned about that in the U.S., right? Promotional opportunities, not significant across any of the countries. Those two that are majorly important intrinsic factors across huge bodies of research. You can also see the physical effort and danger, interestingly, across these countries was not significant in any of these countries, which was actually very surprising to me because given the nature of these economies, particularly in the Philippines and South Korea, where you have high level of industrial sector and agricultural sector, those tend to be the types of places where people are much more concerned about their physical danger, the effort, the work, the physical work that they have to put into performing a job versus a dominant service sector economy where it's more white-collar type of work generally.
When you look at the job satisfaction, look at this similar table within sectors, for example, in the Philippines, agriculture and service, agriculture, service, and industrial.
Yeah, so it's super interesting if we break it down by, I mean, if we can break these results down by a lot of these different elements and factors, and sectoral composition is very important in that. Generally speaking, in service sector jobs, these intrinsic factors are much more significant and more prominent in their predictive value than the extrinsic factors. In more industrialized jobs, in agriculture, the extrinsic tend to be much more salient than the intrinsic. Yeah.
It just strikes me, to some extent it's entirely expected, simply because this is all about liberal values, individual liberal values.
Sure, yeah.
And the countries you're looking at largely have more socially constructed, I won't say illiberal because that's an awful word, non-liberal values. And so, to some extent, it's what you'd probably expect. Anyway,
yeah, that's a great point. So in part that comes back to the cultural differences that we see across these.
The ideologies.
Yeah, yes. So the cultural differences, the ideologies, and how they vary and differ across these countries absolutely impact
But you're controlling for that, right?
the saliency. So I'm controlling for not in what I'm showing you here. In the more complex hierarchical linear model, I control for these cultural values. But I'll tell you, because I'm not showing you the table. It's a very huge, ridiculous table. None of these are significant. So when I run that model, all of this falls away. None of it's significant. And about half of these other structural economic variables are significant. And so again, does that mean that culture doesn't matter? Well, of course not. Culture, it's all interconnected, and culture certainly matters, and it shapes how we perceive our experience and how a worker is going to rate themselves on these various characteristics. So culture absolutely matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. And that's my main takeaway here. Again, for this group, where we're interested in foreign policy issues and we're interested in economic development issues and all these things, that shouldn't be any huge surprise. Within the academic world, and particularly like within the business world, this is kind of counterintuitive and kind of flies in the face of what a lot of research has said, which tends to focus almost primarily on cross-cultural differences. So I think that's an interesting and important contribution there. I'm taking too long, so I will leave it there and turn the time over to Kim, and then we can further discuss implications and conclusions, I think, together as we take questions. So thank you.
Thank you, John. That was terrifically interesting, and we'll get Kim up here and have some comments, further comments.
Oops, I was going to say leave that.
Oh,
maybe,
I can pull it back up. Okay.
Hopefully people can see around me. So, pleasure to be here. I wished I'd had a paper because there's a lot of really interesting stuff in here, but some of it a little bit hard to follow just from the PowerPoint. But I just want to echo what Satu said, first of all, about this. I think this is really important work that we do need to understand more about what's going on with workers, including their attitudes, and that it is important, as you said, and just to reemphasize that not just for the workers' welfare themselves, but it affects the productivity of firms, and in turn that can affect the sort of growth and development trajectories of at least the less developed countries in the sample. So really important topic and really interesting work, and really look forward to seeing more of it as it goes forward. I sort of divided my remarks as I was thinking about it, that it's also really ambitious, and that you're trying to look at changes in work and in attitudes across time, across countries, and to some degree by sector, although that didn't come out in the empirical work that presented here. But and so sort of some comments in each of those areas. And one was on, we discussed a little bit just in going through the presentation about given the limitations of the data, how much you can really conclude about trends or structural shifts as opposed to cyclical things.
Sure.
Because it is a point, these are a point in time, it's not continuous data, the nature of the surveys. And so I did wonder, as I was looking at some of the figures, well, is this an artifact of the Asian financial crisis or of the Great Recession a few years ago? And so a little more sort of teasing out of really what's structural and what's cyclical, I think would be one interesting thing to look a little more carefully at. A second one that, again, this is sort of the limitation, but is the range of countries. And one, it would be interesting for you to explain why this particular set of countries. Why is Russia? I understand that China's not in the surveys part. I guess you can't do that, but sort of why is Russia in there, and how is that a useful comparator? And you mentioned sort of the EU looks rather different, so it would have been interesting to see some other outside of the region comparators, just to see sort of how different does Northeast Asia and the Philippines look from some other parts of the world. Let's see. And then I mentioned the sectoral differences. You sort of had some in the up front in the theory of why the sector would matter. One, sort of looking at your chart, at least three of those dimensions more or less seem to go along with development. So is it the sector or is it development, and sort of, but then going to the actual empirical results that you showed, one of the interesting things that I saw was that if you go first to which one is the comparative country level statistics, that actually, South Korea doesn't fit the model in terms of, you noted that it has a much larger industrial sector than the others. It has and a relatively smaller service sector. And then you go to the next table, and South Korea also has the lowest job satisfaction of all the countries that are in the sample. And so it just made me wonder sort of what's going on with South Korea. It also has one of the, I think, by far the lowest union density. And you notice there was declining confidence in unions, but they're not a very big factor in Korea. And then there's the strife and so forth that's going on. So sort of, it looks to me like South Korea would be a great case study to dig in further of what's going on here and why does it look, even within this relatively small sample, look different on some of these key dimensions. Just one sort of on the empirical, I'm not an econometrician myself. When I've worked with them in the past, they have said that OLS is not good for a truncated dependent variable. So something to think about is this something where you could use logit or one of the other techniques that that works better with truncated dependent variables that are not continuous and ongoing. But then there was also on those results, I couldn't help. I mean the interesting work I think is this one is the sort of strongest and most robust and significant, and it sort of seems like you would expect that to be very highly correlated with job satisfaction. And so I wonder if it could be masking, because it is, it could almost be an instrumental variable, right? You can almost substitute it for job satisfaction and potentially. So I'm just wondering if having that in there is masking some significance of some of the other variables that might be interesting. And again, the fact that variable, even for South Korea, is significant where almost nothing else is. So maybe we'd see something else going on in South Korea if we just maybe try dropping that variable and see what happens. seems like I had something else on that, but now I've lost it. And then just a couple of other things. One that, I think I like that you're looking at the subjective data, but I would still like to see a little bit more, and maybe, in terms of the control variables, some other, objective data, labor market data on what's going on in terms of beyond the employment, what's going on with wages, working hours, and some of those other things that we would expect to be correlated with job satisfaction, where we can actually get hard data on what's going on.
And time in a job. I kept thinking about how long.
Tenure, if you can get it.
Tenure,
That's
if you can get it, it's probably tough to
probably
get,
hard. I mean,
right.
there's some of this data at the ILO, and it's in the key labor, what are they called, labor market indicators, key indicators of the labor market. I don't know what the country's coverage.
To include in this type of model, you can't do that, of course, because it's country level, but in a hierarchical model, including some of those variables would be very interesting.
And then the final comment, again, it would be, I think, more for the hierarchical model, the other models. But again, as we started out talking about how a lot of this is now very much on the agenda because of globalization and the effects of globalization on jobs and labor markets and job satisfaction. So it would be interesting to try and do a model that includes some of those measures of globalization across countries or sectors, just to see whether, in fact, what we think we know about the impact of globalization actually shows up at all in the data. And I think that was sort of what I had prepared. Again, very interesting, and I look forward to seeing more of the detailed work.
Awesome.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so very much, Kim. Where we started off in the broad scope, I'm, as I said, not in this field, but, on some of the work that's being done on trade, and you started out, John, I think very interestingly, talking about populism and nationalism. And I kept wondering throughout this is, things like state policy's impact. Japan is trying to make the lives of its workers better. That is to say, make them work less, take more time off, use vacations, create better living conditions, work-life balance issues. This is state policy. It's not private sector. I mean, the state is imposing rules, regulations, opportunities, incentives, disincentives to sort of change the way people feel about their job, right? Which has other policy impulses like raising the birth rate so that people aren't at work. So I kept wondering as I was listening to this how that affects. The other thing that I was thinking about, particularly in the advanced countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, in this case, maybe Russia for all I know. One thing that keeps coming up in labor literature that I see at this marginal level that I see it is self-work, kind of the new, what do they call it? There's a term for it. I've heard this, you've seen it on the front page of the newspapers. What kind of economy where, people drive Uber cars and they do the gig economy. And, part of the gig economy discussion is culture, too, right? About not answering to the man, deciding your hours, flex, you shape your work-life balance. There are no expectations. You kill your meat, you eat your meat, but you don't have all of these other encumbrances on you. And
except you go broke.
Well, that's a whole other issue. It may not be a work-life balance. I'm not at all suggesting the gig economy is useful. I'm suggesting these are some of the things that are at play in discussions of labor satisfaction and labor participation and how people work. And I was wondering about, whether some follow-on could. And then the final thing I just wanted to say is, you mentioned FDI only once. And I'm always, I'm profoundly struck by this as a non-economist, non-labor person, that we talk about trade. Trade is now either a panacea or a cause of all of our problems, right? It's the trade. And yet trade is one of the things that's changed the most in terms of production supply chain from the old. Yeah. No one talks about FDI impacts. And I'm always struck by this because... Ted Moran, of course, would talk about FDI. But But some of the work we've been doing on this Asia Matters initiative about FDI into the U.S. and what kinds of employment impacts it has, not on quality of workers or quality of your job or thing, but just to sort of suggest, how many people are employed in this way. And one of the things that keeps coming up is some of the FDI is creating jobs at a much higher level in terms of pay scale and security than the transitional jobs that are either phasing out or otherwise. And I just kept wondering as I was listening to you how that plays into your analysis, because this populist and nationalism thing has been built around trade, but not FDI, not so much about movement of capital. Again, these are observations from a complete non-specialist about.
Great point.
The other one related to that is
Please,
migration,
Patrick. Yeah.
Remittances.
Remittances.
Because particularly with the Philippines, but increasingly with China, if you've got structural rigidities in your country, Kerala in India is a classic.
Yes.
Then everybody moves out.
I mean,
Sends
look.
the
Or
money
in
back.
Japan, where
Yeah.
you could
But
address
they all-
this,
Right.
the labor shortages by
Yeah,
loosening
bring
up
them
on
in.
immigration.
And that has to factor into it. The family is better off, but the poor individual stuck in some,
Yeah.
Middle East sort of, not pleasant place, is really worse off for quite a period.
Yeah.
And which comes to the family sort of work-life balance at a really fundamental level.
And it comes up in the Philippines a lot.
Yeah.
And, outflow of workers from China, who are going abroad, not only capital but also labor is
Yeah.
going abroad. India, it's a huge issue. I mean, Indian companies are on record as at times saying, it's easier to invest in the U.S. or a plant somewhere else than it is in India, because it's just easier to set it up and have company profits. So I forget what year it was. I believe it was 2013 that Australia, Japan, and India invested more in the United States than the U.S. invested in those countries that year. There's enormous ramifications for how labor is seen, how labor is perceived. Anyway,
Some
Anyone
cost
else?
investment's a bit of dodgy accounting by companies.
that may well be. That may well be. Yeah, please come in.
A question actually about the surveys.
Just
you
introduce
used.
yourself
Jim
so they
Sack,
know who you.
retired. A question about the surveys you use. The American users of survey community have gotten very concerned about non-response and validity of their surveys, especially in the last decade, because non-response has increased. It's also clearly non-random. These surveys in Asia, have they found increasing non-response rates?
Yeah, good question. So maybe I can take just a couple minutes and talk about methodology generally a little bit more, and maybe address some of your points as well with the methodology. So actually, the response rates are very good with the International Social Survey Program. They vary, of course, a little bit by country, but they're at the level where we would hope and expect them to be, up around the high 60s to 80% range. No, and part of the reason is different countries. In some countries, they're done as surveys over the phone. Some countries, they're mail surveys. Some countries, they're in-person interviews. They ask the same questions, but it's done differently across countries depending on that element, that context, because they're seeking a high response rate specifically. And so that's a very good question, but something that actually isn't really a problem with this data set, which is nice. Yeah.
The response varies. If somebody rings me up and engages in a conversation, says, "What do I think about this, this, and this?" It's quite different to one of the endless online surveys I get, where I'm much more random, as it were, in my response. So you get up reliability issues, depending on. And so that becomes an apples and oranges comparison if you have a face-to-face versus a mail versus.
How you compare those?
Yeah, you're right. And that's a very good point. As of yet, they haven't done online surveys for these, but the other three are, they have done face-to-face mail or interviews. And so, yeah, there are some differences, and there's a whole literature around surveying methodology that kind of gets into some of those issues.
John, are there national data sets? Presumably, I mean, I can only think of Japan, but because I spent years there. But so they collect data on everything. I mean, they're very empirically minded, and so governments ask all kinds of things about they have all these data sets. Couldn't you, as a methodology, use some of the national data sets to compare with this international cross-national set? Because they're
Good way of validating.
In terms of the country-contextual
right.
stuff?
And also to validate the data.
Or validate the data, because, I mean, there may be this cross-national, international set of data. But the national, I mean, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, I don't know about the Philippines or Russia, nothing. But certainly South Korea, Taiwan, Japan they're quite good about monitoring this stuff. And they have very good response rates because it's, for the lack of a better word, state capitalism, right?
So are you asking, for example, if there's like a national, in South Korea, national data set for job satisfaction that I can compare this to?
There may well be.
There isn't. So
there isn't.
Yeah, unfortunately,
That's
no.
shocking. That's really shocking.
So what we do have, the two international data sets that I pulled data from, the World Value Survey and the International Social Survey, those are the two main ones for attitudes. And you can go into different regions, and like there's the European Social Survey, but that just feeds into the International Social Survey, right? So really those are the two main ones, and there is some crossover. And so to the extent possible, when there's some related items and variables across the data sets, then yeah, absolutely, you compare them to see if to cross-validate and to triangulate, and pretty much they fit. I mean, it depends on the variables specifically that you're looking at, but there's nothing hugely out of whack in terms of these variables.
I see.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, please, Jenna. Introduce yourself, Jenna.
Hi, I'm Jenna. I'm from Dartmouth, and I was really interested because I'm also an economics major, and I just completed a development research for my prof. I was interested in your model. Does it control for the percentage of, you might have mentioned it, percentage of agriculture, percentage of those variables, like the percentage service sector?
Sector. Yeah.
So this model does not. So if I go back, here, what I presented to you in that last data table was this over. Okay. This over. So the individual controls and then individual responses within each of those countries. What happens at the hierarchical level in that model is that you control for these, which are the same. You assign it by country, right? So everyone within a country has. It's not as good as if you could measure culture by each individual person, but nobody really does that, and so this is really the only way you can do it. So you measure these across country, which is the same for every individual within that country. So you can't run regressions or logits or anything like that because it just messes. It doesn't work. But within a hierarchical model, then you absolutely can. So you control for all of these across countries. And then at the second level of analysis, you introduce all the individual data, and then you can see which of these factors are significant.
So the data set doesn't help for each individual entry doesn't have their jobs coded this person A has agriculture.
That is a great question, and I so wish that they had more detail. It depends on the country. Some countries have more specific detail about what each individual respondent, what their job is and looks like. For the most part, it doesn't get particularly specific. It asks them full-time, part-time, no questions specifically about sector. Doesn't do sector, which would be hugely valuable.
India's national statistics survey varies right down.
Yeah, the National Informatics Center does pretty good.
So
That's because of the planning requirement. Used to be the planning requirement, the 5-year plans.
Yeah, so part of
So they could allocate resources.
Part of the challenge with doing this, and as you said, it's kind of ambitious analysis, is that we're doing these two vastly different levels of analysis simultaneously, right? And so to have these types of work characteristics and values or self-reported scores on these different characteristics, that's super important. That provides us with really great information, but we can't connect it, with all these other also very important factors, because the survey itself, the International Social Survey, doesn't include those. So you can't connect them specifically to individuals. And that's why the multi-level analysis is helpful to try to get at it, but it's not perfect. And there's still limitations to doing that kind of analysis. And it would be so much better if we measured culture for each individual respondent. It would be so much better if we could say specifically for each individual respondent what sector they work in. Some of those types of things, right? That would hugely increase the value of the analysis we can run. So at this point, we still see lots of interesting things come out of this type of an analysis, but it is limited because of that. Yeah.
You're writing this up, right?
Yeah.
Are you doing an East West Center publication as well? In one of the series?
I can work on something like that.
That would be really, I hope some thread or part of it. I realize it's a large, so if there's an angle that could be particularly policy relevant for our Asia Pacific issue series, for example, or even the monograph series, it'd be wonderful if you could consider it, because I'm always trying to vector these kinds of things into our institution's publication series.
Along with that, I appreciate that. And back to your point too, I think one of the things that is very helpful, and I've done this to a limited extent as I've done a deep dive into not these particular countries, but some other countries, say France, for example. I've done a deep dive in France, in the U.S., and a few other countries. To do a deep dive case analysis that includes this data, but then goes much more in detail into the laws, the policies, all those sorts of things within a given country, which you can't possibly do when you start to ramp up the scope of number of countries. You can't do that in a paper, right? Or even in a presentation. And so, but that's really helpful, because this gives us somewhat of a look at the context, but it's a very high level look at the context. But it's super helpful when we can dig deeper and really start to look for specific explanations for why we see these differences.
Yeah, just the other thing that's interesting about South Korea, because in a lot of my work on labor standards, it's been more looking at a lot of the garment sector in less developed countries.
Yeah.
And you hear a lot. It's more anecdotal because the data doesn't exist. But I find it really fascinating that there's low job satisfaction in South Korea. The management-employer relations is not very significant. And you hear a lot that in the garment sector in developing countries, quite often the biggest problems are in Korean-owned factories. And in fact, the U.S. Department of Labor, when we did the FTA with Korea, which all of our FTAs, of course, include a labor chapter, well, in the context of Korea, it wasn't so much about, maybe it should have been more about labor conditions in Korea, but it was more, they tried to engage them on South Korea, their labor conditions in their factories where they were invested abroad. So there were, if you sort of wanted to connect it to some of these globalization issues, I think South Korea just looks to me like it'd be a fascinating case study on all kinds of levels. I mean, it would take you well afield of what you're doing here, but it could be really interesting.
But I love drill down. So drilling down is this provides a 20,000 foot overview, right? And then drilling down is super helpful. And I would love to dig more into Korea. Another question?
Patrick, or
I
something?
was going to ask
please.
about South Korea. Does South Korea still have a garment sector?
No, they're doing the investing.
No, the investing
No, they don't
overseas.
have, they don't have factories anymore.
As managers in
Yeah.
where they're investing
Right.
overseas, there are lots of issues. Yeah.
Like in
They
Cambodia.
still have a pretty large textile
Violence,
sector, so they're still selling
Yeah,
textiles, but not.
they don't do it.
Yeah,
It's
not
not factory
garments.
work. There aren't very many textile or garment factory work in South Korea anymore.
Some textiles, yes, that's more capital intensive,
And
more
that's the-
machinery. They don't do the labor intensive assembly end much anymore.
Patrick, did you have something? And then we're a couple minutes from closing time.
No, it's interesting, but I do have trouble with the data sources, world 80 surveys and all those sorts of things. I look at them, then my instinct is, do they actually talk to the street kids? And so is it a middle class urban bias? And people have said, no, they try to randomise it, but I really...
But in this case, if you're talking about labor satisfaction, worker satisfaction, then is it wrong?
It probably doesn't matter.
Then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not talking to the street kid, but the street kid, you're not measuring the street kid's worker satisfaction.
I wish we could find out.
But then
that
you should
would be
ask them about a
fantastic.
different set of questions.
Yes.
Like who's stealing from you and why are you on the street? But
Who's to rip off?
I mean, it's a really important point when we're talking about attitudinal surveys generally, but then we start to do cross-national comparisons. Ultimately, I didn't collect the data myself, so I can't 100% speak to how it was collected. But they have pretty thorough. Both of these international surveys have very thorough descriptions of their methods and documentation and how they run everything. And they claim to be, and I don't have any reason to suspect that they're not, that they're stratified random samples in these countries, and so it's absolutely healthy to view things, carefully. But I think as far as attitudinal data goes, I don't think if we want to analyze attitudes, I don't think we're going to find it better. Unless if I went out and collected my own data, I would do it differently. There are different questions I would ask.
We wouldn't see you for a few years.
But yes, you wouldn't see me for a decade, and so you that's part of the issues. You deal with what you have. I did want to also if I can just respond to a couple other quick methodology things, and then the general future trajectories question, which I think is really, really important. So one, and I don't know how much this interests you in terms of statistical methodology, but you brought up the econometrics point about OLS, and just if you care, I don't know if you care, but I did actually run. You can't run logit models with Likert scale, but you can, or you can, but it's really clumsy. Really, the best model, the best statistical model for this is an ordered probit model. But there's actually quite a bit of statistical methodological literature that looks at specifically job satisfaction, the Likert scale of a job satisfaction, and how that actually very closely mirrors a continuous variable. So even though it's not a continuous variable technically, it's pretty much seen by respondents as a continuous variable. And so when I actually run an ordered probit model versus an OLS model, basically the results are the same. Only the ordered probit model is a little bit more it's just more complicated and is a little bit harder to interpret. And so when presenting it to people, I usually do an OLS. So that's one point that I don't know if that'll ever matter to you again in the future. But if you do work with job satisfaction in the future, that might be of interest. Also, just because your point about correlation is a really good one, I just want to reassure everyone that I have there's no collinearity problems, and I've run the correlation matrices, and there's no problem there in terms of overly high correlations that would mess up the results, as you were suggesting. And that's certainly something that we should always be careful of. Anytime we're running these types of models, we need to make sure that we don't have variables that skew and mess everything up. So that's not the case here, though I absolutely understand your point, and it's a very important one that we need to be careful of. The last point, and I guess we're about out of time, is just the trajectories moving to the future. I think, globalization, the continuous interconnectedness of not just various aspects of the economy, but specifically the labor force, is really increasingly important. One thing that I'm particularly very interested in, and I haven't done any work cross-nationally with this, but I've done work within the U.S. on this, is just the shifting nature of the the psychological contract of between the employer and the employee that we've seen just shift hugely over the last 50 years in the U.S. You think about baby boomer baby boomer generation largely gets employed by an employer, maybe switch jobs a few times, but mostly they tend to go to work with a company and stay with that company for most of their career. And over time, that's gotten less and less and less and less. And now we're to the point where we're like this gig economy, right? And part of that is millennials and like what millennials want out of a job and work. But a huge part of that is organizations. And organizations have been moving more and more towards part-time work, contractual work, those types of things. Piecework. And so it's more and more. I'm just super interested to see, will this trend, if this trend continues at like the rate we've been going, then in 20 years, there will be very few actual like full-time jobs at a company, and it'll almost all be project-based gig work, right? And I don't know if that's sustainable, but that's the trajectory we're going. And globally, I don't know. Like, I just have no idea. And what is, I mean, it's one thing when we're talking about the U.S., which is, 80+% service sector. But what do you do when you go to a country that's much more dominant industrial or agricultural? You can't, can gig work? It's hard for me to wrap my mind around that. So super interesting questions as we contemplate what could happen in the next decade, the next 2 decades. So hopefully this was at least helpful in providing somewhat of a framework of how we can think about some of the different influences that impact conditions in the workplace.
Well, I really appreciate it. As I said, John, it was terrific to hear about the work you did at our home office in lovely Honolulu, and to be able to hear you here. And I'm not at all disappointed. In fact, it's just spurred more questions. I can't help but say, as you entered on future trajectories, I'm always thinking about the future. And I was just reading a piece on Indonesia about how they've leapfrogged problems with infrastructure and gridlock and transportation gridlock with this. Someone will know the term. I will get this wrong. Jekko economy, where everything is delivered on these two-wheelers, food and services. So, innovations are fascinating, right? And I just to be naughty, forgive me, just to be naughty, I kept wondering, I wonder if there's ever going to be a time when someone's going to have to do a survey on AI, robotic satisfaction, both consumer, user, and deliverer, because they're going to be doing so many of these jobs. Right? I would just think, just for fun, thinking, well, how do you measure satisfaction of elderly folks in Japan, for example, being taken care of by AI and robots? And I can think of all kinds of labor permutations in the future. But we are at time. I deeply appreciate Kim Elliott joining us. We have folks on our podcast, so we'll finish the recording here, but I really want to say this is terrific work. I hope you'll consider writing in our East-West Center, one or other of our East-West Center publication series. Kim, delighted to finally meet you in person, and know our colleague, our shared colleague, Dr. Ellen Frost, couldn't be here, but look forward to engaging you another time on this work. And for all of you thanking us, and for those watching, thank you for tuning in. There's plenty more food. Thanks again. To both of you.